Lời đầu tiên xin chào các độc giả đã đến với website rèn luyện kỹ năng.com. Khi tìm đến với website rèn luyện kỹ năng, chắc hẳn bạn đang mong muốn tìm cho mình một công cụ tốt nhất trong quá trình rèn luyện kỹ năng. Kỹ năng ở đây có thể là kỹ năng lãnh đạo, kỹ năng bán hàng, kỹ năng mềm, kỹ năng sống và rất nhiều các kỹ năng khác. Thông thường khi nghĩ đến việc rèn luyện các kỹ năng như chúng tôi đã đề cập ở trên, chúng ta thường hay nghĩ đến việc tìm mua cái đầu sách hoặc tham gia các chương trình hội thảo. Nhưng trong cuộc sống bận rộn của thế kỷ 21, thời gian và tiền bạc là hai thứ luôn bị giới hạn nhiều nhất. Với sự ra đời của website rèn luyện kỹ năng.com, chúng tôi mang đến cho bạn một công cụ tốt hơn trong việc rèn luyện kỹ năng của mình, đó chính là các DVD rèn luyện kỹ năng. Bạn sẽ không còn phải tốn quá nhiều thời gian để đọc sách hay tốn quá nhiều tài chính để tham gia các chương trình hội thảo. Chỉ cần bỏ DVD vào đầu máy, ngay lập tức bạn đã có thể tận hưởng những thước phim quý giá được chia sẻ từ các diễn giả nổi tiếng tại Việt Nam và trên thế giới. Website rèn luyện kỹ năng.com cung cấp đầy đủ cho bạn các DVD rèn luyện kỹ năng trên nhiều lĩnh vực. Tất cả các DVD rèn luyện kỹ năng của các diễn giả nước ngoài có tại website rèn luyện kỹ năng.com đều có phụ đề 100% hỗ trợ tối đa cho quý độc giả khi theo dõi. Rèn luyện kỹ năng.com cam kết chất lượng tất cả các DVD khi cung cấp cho quý khách hàng. Với hân hạnh được phục vụ cho rất nhiều các khách hàng trên cả nước. Chỉ cần click đặt hàng, trong vòng 1 đến 3 ngày, bạn đã có thể cầm sản phẩm trong tay. Rèn luyện kỹ năng hân hạnh được phục vụ quý khách.
We live in a busy world, a very fast-paced world. So it's more important than ever that we take the time to slow down. And in the world of communication, it means take the time to slow down to focus on our core message so that we can identify what's important and what's not. Presentation Zen is an approach, not really a method. You know, a method is something you pull off the shelf and can follow step by step. So Presentation Zen is really about an approach to seeing, to identifying the problem in a way that will help you make much better presentations. So, you know, every presentation basically has 3 chunks, right? You have the preparation and you have the design, and then in the end you have to deliver it. And that's pretty much standard with every presentation. So I've taken 3 ideas out of the world of Zen, which are very, very simple ideas. The first one is restraint. Restraint especially applies to preparation. We want to identify what's important and what's not, and take what's not important for the moment and put that aside. And that takes a lot of willpower and to sort of restrain ourselves to let go of our babies and leave those out, at least for the moment. The second thing is simplicity. Well, but what does simplicity mean? Simplicity means many different things for many kinds of people, but basically it means the old, you know, less is more kind of thing. Visually, we want to include only what's necessary to get the point across, and the superfluous and the non-essential can be removed for the time being. And the third thing, of course, when we're talking about delivery, is naturalness. How can you make your delivery a much more natural and much more engaging type of thing? And of course, words like conversation come to mind. People like Steve Jobs, of course, who, even though he's speaking to, let's say, 5,000 people at a Macworld, he comes across in a very conversational manner. So that's sort of the goal with naturalness. Every week I get emails from people who have read Presentation Zen or who follow the blog. And recently I got an email from a technologist in India who said that really following this approach sort of changed his life in a way because he had this great content, but his presentation sort of followed the same old way, the sort of death by bullet point approach. And he took some of these ideas, made it much more visual, much more engaging. He himself became a much more engaging figure, and it changed his life because people were listening and they were getting his important message. So I think no matter what field you're in, if you look at Presentation Zen and follow the approach, keeping in mind, you know, the restraint, design, simplicity, all of that, I think you'll be prepared to make really, really incredibly great presentations. Now, what is a slidegement? Well, that's a slide and document. You put it together and you get a slidegement. And this happens when people try to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. The only problem is no birds are killed, which is great if, you're a bird, but for everyone else, we get a document that sort of looks like this, where there's not enough information to be a useful document, and there's too much information, certainly too much text, to be a visual. And this is what happens when we don't exercise restraint. The opposite of restraint to me is actually laziness, right? We just don't take the time to bother with this idea of paring down and focusing on what's important. So one piece of advice then is to remember in the preparation stage that you can have a proper handout and that you should make a proper handout. And if you do that, in the handout, that's where more of the details can go. And it can be spelled out, it can be written out in a very logical fashion. And if you do that up front, then you won't feel compelled to cram your slides with lots of information that you don't actually need, but you sometimes put it in there, well, just in case, right? Someone says, well, what about this piece of data? Well, if it's in the handout, then you won't feel compelled to do that. So you might be saying, what's Zen got to do with it? I actually have lived in Japan for almost 20 years, except for times when I was in graduate school or when I worked for Apple. I've been living in around Tokyo or Osaka or even in the Japanese countryside. So Zen, which was born in India and then moved to China and grew up in China, but really took root and flourished in Japan. And it's at the heart of Japanese culture. And we don't verbalize Zen, of course, on the streets of Japan, but it is there. And for me, it's been a very sort of profound experience studying the Zen arts. And I've seen that you can apply the principles and the principles of Zen and Zen practice to many aspects of life, including work and including presentations. There are many concepts in Zen, but for me it's all about simplicity. And simplicity, which sort of has gotten a bad rap, certainly in the United States and in the Western world in general, simplicity is not about dumbing things down or leaving out what's important or sort of, trying to skirt an issue, for example. Simplicity is actually quite profound and very powerful, and it isn't even easy to do. But by the end of this video, and if you read the book, I think you'll have some concepts that will help you, leverage this idea of simplicity and bringing out what's important and leaving the non-important behind. So simplicity isn't necessarily simple to do, but for our audience, for our end users, it will be extremely powerful to do. The first step in the preparation process is to identify the core, to identify, the real essential thrust of the presentation. And one way to do that, really the first thing, is to first clear your mind so that you can identify what's important. And this brings up something that I learned from the world of Zen, which is called the beginner's mind, or sometimes it's called the child's mind. And what that means is, we are all experts, of course, in our fields, but if you adopt the beginner's mind or the child's mind, there are many possibilities to a problem. As experts, we kind of get locked into the traditional way of thinking about things, and we know of myriad of ways, many possibilities of why this can't be done or why that hasn't been done. So in the beginner's mind, they say, there are many possibilities. But in the expert's mind, there are few. So although we are experts to some degree or another, if we just sort of put that aside for a while and just look at the problem in a new way, we can often sort of see things that we didn't know were actually there. And that's very important when we're trying to identify the core. Okay, but how? How do we clear our mind? How do we adopt a beginner's mind so that we can identify what's important? So one thing I always recommend is to go analog. And what I mean by that is to not prepare at the computer, but to get a million miles away from the computer, actually. So if you can't do that physically, then just turn off the computer so that you won't be distracted. And in fact, when we're on the computer, we're always online, aren't we? And it is said that the always online person is sort of the always distracted person. So if you get off the grid, that is, get offline, get away from the computer, you sort of have the freedom now to just focus on what's important. I recommend taking a legal pad or some notebook or something like that, or maybe just a whiteboard, in a conference room by yourself. But get away from technology so that you can identify what's important and what's not. So while we're off the grid and we're thinking about our presentation, this reminds me of a phrase that we often say, that I often say in Japanese, which is dakara nani, which just means so what, right? But this is a question we don't often ask ourselves, and we need to ask ourselves in the preparation stage. Long before we even begin to design the presentation, we have to identify what our point is and also why it matters. So when we ask ourselves, what is the meaning and especially why it matters to our audience, that's when we can identify what's important and what's not. And it may be cool to us, but it might not really go back and support the core. And if it doesn't, that's when we just have to cut it out. And this is what we do in the preparation stage that a lot of presenters fail to do. They sometimes say, well, better safe than sorry, so I'll just include that stuff, even if it doesn't really go back to support the point. So remember, always use restraint and ask yourself, is this really important? And what does this mean? From my audience's point of view, does it help the story? We're hardwired to tell stories and to understand stories. And in fact, before we could write, we were